like to welcome everybody here on behalf of Thompson & Knight and the World Affairs Council. This is the third program in a new series that we've been sponsoring this year that is focusing on international affairs. Now, today's program focuses on how we can strengthen business ties between the two countries, the United States and India. Particularly now, as it looks like perhaps the world is going, or at least facing the prospect of a global recession. As India continues to transition toward a more open economy, its political stability and projected growth rate make it a very attractive opportunity for businesses, particularly for places like the United States. On the other hand, the United States is also seeking to attract more international investment with our low interest rates, visa reforms, and a variety of initiatives to spur growth. I myself represent a number of companies from India, and it's interesting to see that the United States itself is becoming seen as a resource play. So the question we have is, what partnership opportunities do we have to secure cross-border transactions with one another? And what reforms are necessary in both countries to keep foreign investment strong for our two countries? I want to ask a question directed to both of you, but somehow I'll start with you. What can U.S. companies be doing to gain access to the Indian markets? How can they become competitive in India?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably in pretty much 90% of U.S. companies' board agenda, because we have done a lot of work in India, as I mentioned. It takes time. So the first and foremost, I would always say is, you got to make the commitment to India real. A lot of U.S. companies, the mistake they do is what I would call it as, I have a guy in India. That kind of thing. Well, we have a couple of guys in India, so we are in the Indian market, right? So you have to, the opportunity is real, so which means you have to make the bold commitment. So I'm actually very glad to see it's actually in a lot of boards' agenda, because that's where it has to start. You have to make a bold commitment that you're going to be in India. That's number one. Number two, I would say is, you have to think about a localized business model. There's a tendency always to think about, okay, India is how the Western world is 20 years ago. The very notion that India will develop like some other country or a Western country is seriously flawed, because India talked about some of the challenges in India, such as infrastructure issues, such as ability to get things done. They are very unique to India in many ways. So the very notion that India will develop like some other country and eventually they will all have this, eventually they'll all do this is seriously flawed. So a lot of companies do that mistake, saying that, well, eventually, India will get there, they will start using this product. So you have to think about localized business model. So what does that mean? So you have to rethink your, price performance equation. 10 years ago, I was meeting with one of the major Indian customers, and what and he told me this, we were trying to negotiate a major contract, and he told me this, so what I want is 90% of your product, because the remaining 10% costs 50% more. And I don't want that, because all these bells and whistles you have, I don't need it, So you have to seriously rethink the price performance equation. What is the price performance equation that works in India? The second you have to rethink is about your labor capital, values in your business model. So the tendency is saying that, we are going to automate everything, is probably not the right business model in India, And auto companies have figured that out, actually. An auto company may use like 2,000 robots in their manufacturing, plant in Detroit or in Kentucky. But you go to India, that equation is totally changed, because of the ability of available, cost-effective labor needs to figure in as a big component in your plan. So that leads to what is the performance metrics you use. Many companies have a tendency to say, well, we want to be 20% operating margin company. We need to be 10% this. So you have to think about your operating performance metric. What is the true performance metrics that measures success in India? So instead of thinking about margin, maybe you should think about return of capital employed, because you can generate a lot more returns to a dollar of capital employed in India. You know, so the localized business model and the localized product customization is an extremely important element in India. The third, you should think about talent. As I mentioned to you, I think Anya pointed that out, the number of people going into 40% of India's, population is under the age of 25. And if you go under the age of 30, it even goes up to 55 or 60%. So this is a significantly aspiration-oriented talent pool. We think about here, given the employment here, it's about 2% raise is, really good. And I've seen many corporations saying that, okay, company-wide, we are going to give 2% raise or 3% raise to attract them. It's not going to happen in India, right? You need to be very, very conscious about what is the talent pool availability, what is the aspiration, how do you attract them, and how do you retain them? So that's a very important element in India. And fourth thing I would say is you have to think about risk management. And particularly around the corruption area, right? So I think Anya pointed out very well, the best approach to do on that is start with a no, right? And there's a significant difference in India on the sectors you deal with, right? And also whether it is a private enterprise versus a government entity, how you deal with them. And there's also a recognition in India, and particularly within the various licensing agencies or approval agencies, that a typical Western company, will not entertain these type of practices. There's a growing awareness. In fact, we have been very successful in conducting our businesses, without getting involved in any of those type of activities. Now, just before the meeting, I was talking to Raj here, and he was mentioning about how about in the lower levels when you go to these agencies. Okay, the director of, so-and-so agency understands that, but what about the lower level? That's a very interesting point, right? So what we do in our ways is our general managers spend a lot more time. Actually, when that situation arises, they will directly go to get the job done, So now, does it take a lot of work and time? And things should be a lot simpler? I agree, things should be a lot simpler. But on the other hand, the evolution of this is going to be a slow process in India. I grew up in India. This is to a large extent in the fabric, right? It's in the large extent in the fabric. So which means changes of this nature, you cannot, wish to happen overnight, right? So it has to go through a growing awareness. The only thing I can say is, if I take a snapshot in day 10 years ago in India, or 5 years ago in India, and a snapshot in day now, things are very different. So risk, you have to think about risk management, and constantly be aware on training and constantly emphasizing things. And the last thing I would say is, you have to think about your productivity improvements and deployment, because inflation in India is high. So when you start thinking about, I'm not talking about commodity inflation, wage inflation, right? So when you start doing a business model and you say that, I want to deploy, based on today's rate, and then I do this escalation, that equation is going to be very different in India. So when you want to enter India, you need to think about, okay, how am I going to get productivity gain, So you have to start focusing on productivity gains right up front, whether it is through continuous improvement processes, lean implementation, because a lot of US companies, struggle in India with that, because they don't start in the beginning. They think first thing is let's start it up and then worry about lean implementations later. But going back and doing it is much harder. So you have to start from the beginning so you can offset this inflationary pieces with productivity increases. And then the most important thing and final thing in India is be patient. Things do take time. So you have to stay with the process, but once you get there, things work. And once you get to that point where, you have it going, it really works. So I think I would say, to be competitive in India, you have to think about very localized model and really rethink some of these elements, how that applies to India. And one other thing which has worked for us, and I think it has worked for a lot of companies, in fact very well, is use India to enhance your global competitiveness. There are elements of things in India, whether it is the innovation aspects, the engineering aspects. We call it the frugal engineering. Because when I'll give you an example after that. In India, for example, I mean, we all know how we fuel cars here. We are the world's largest manufacturer of fueling nozzles. So when you go to fill the car, the nozzle you use, we are the largest manufacturer of that in the world. And our engineering centers are in Cincinnati, and they think the way we refuel cars in India, in the US, how do we refill? Most of the people pull in the car and then fill up the tank, right? So it may take about 2 minutes to fill a car, or a minute and a half to fill a car. Whereas in India, in a minute, you're probably filling 15 cars, because people are, there's motorcycles, there's auto rickshaws, coming and going, so the number of times the nozzle has to go in and out is very different phenomenon than what is in the US. But, so we keep, our engineers keep designing the nozzle, sending it to India, and we are always not competitive. When we asked our Indian team, okay, finally we realized, oh man, why don't we ask the local guys how to design this? And you know what? They completely stripped down the nozzle, and all they did was made it very light, and all they did was put a little stainless steel tip at the end of the nozzle, because that's the part which gets wearing out, Now, there's no way our people in Cincinnati will think about it, because for them, the very concept that you put like 2 gallons, 1 gallon filling is foreign to them, right? So which means, but now we are actually migrating that nozzle to the US, because what a novel idea, and how cost competitive it is, it enhances our margin,
Right.
So in many ways, whether it is engineering, business process, a lot of those, you can use Indian talent base for your global competitiveness. So I think, if you think in those terms, I think a lot of US companies can find a lot of ways to work in India.
Well, thank you very much.
Can I add one thought? I agree wholeheartedly with this. This is a great presentation. When I see, we have a lot of clients who do a lot of business in India, and the ones who do well do exactly what you just said. They use India, just India as outsourcing is sort of last year. And now it's India as engineering talent, as R&D talent, and they use that R&D sometimes to come back to the US, but often to go to other emerging markets. So an Indian engineer will design the perfect nozzle for emerging, or an IT will design products that are less expensive, maybe don't have all the bells and whistles that you would have in a European or a US market, and will sell incredibly well in Africa and in Brazil and in Latin America. And more you see this model of companies that are truly global, not the hub is in the US and you have a little spoke in India and a spoke. They're really a network that's completely global, and those do the best. And then the second thing I would say is, if you're going to India, these days people go for the Indian market and the demand that's in India that's growing massively in just about every sector. People say this in China, and the Chinese need to raise their demand. In India, it's there, it's growing. In oil and gas, there's double-digit growth in demand every year. They can't get enough, they're now importing 80% of their oil and gas, and that's the case in every single sector that you see. So it's no longer really just an outsourcing and an inexpensive labor destination. It's an innovation center, and it's an enormous market.
Anya, I wonder if, from the point of view of access to the lucrative India market, the growing India markets, do you see any other country, maybe outside of Central Asia, that are maybe more successful than US firms? They're doing things differently. And do you see what it is maybe that they're doing that US firms could be doing?
That are doing well going into India?
Yes.
That's interesting. You do see a lot of Asian conglomerates in India, including the Chinese, of course. Chinese are a big trading partner, although culturally they have issues with the Indians, just like we have issues with the Chinese culturally. I think you see a lot of Indonesian companies. You see some Brazilians. What's striking about the inter-Asian connections is that the U.S. has been really a little absent on the trade negotiations recently, but inter-Asia trade connections are growing unbelievably quickly. So you'll see bilateral trade agreements going every which way. You see agreements with ASEAN and India, and Asia is really becoming the most dynamic economic region in the world and becoming more and more knit up from a trade perspective. So you see a lot of conglomerates from all sides of Asia investing